So we've been using this book by John Fugelsang called Separation of Church and Hate. And I've been kind of dividing up the chapters each week and kind of summarizing it for you and also giving some complementary material. Sometimes that's not in the book just to give context. I'll do that again tonight a little bit. So there's the author. You might see him on TV. He's been on some different TV shows. He's a comic, and he's also a political commentator. And you'll find him sometimes surfacing on different shows. So the best way I can summarize the last couple of chapters of the book is I want to call it religious bigotry. And you'll see what I mean here in a moment. So let's introduce it in this way. So we know that bigotry kind of resides in the hearts of human beings. All you got to do is talk long enough with people, and you'll find that there's shades of bigotry or racism, or there are certain people groups that they don't like. And there might be a variety of reasons for that. Maybe they were hurt by a particular people group, or they feel threatened by a particular people group, and for whatever reason, it kind of shapes how they view a group of people. But the problem comes when you begin to use religion and even more poignantly the name of God to justify either hatred or bigotry in the name of your religion, thinking that you're best representing God. And usually religions have some type of sacred text. For Christians, it's the Bible, although every religion has variations on sacred texts that they have preserved, copied, memorized, and have used for teaching purposes. When you take those sacred texts and you begin to look at them through a lens of hate or bigotry, it is pretty easy to begin to dehumanize other human beings by the way that sacred texts are misused. So sometimes what happens is this feeling or this emotion that is often directed toward other people turns into what I'll call scapegoating. And that is, you begin to use those people as a way of blaming your own disappointments in life, maybe even your own fears of what that group is doing, or maybe jealousy if you feel that that particular group is getting more rights given to them simply because they are of that people group than me, and I don't get those same rights and privileges and so forth. Now, scapegoating can turn an entire group of people into a target, and it is sometimes very simplistic, and you'll see what I mean here in a moment. But it really is a very complex sociological problem. It's my problem, it's what's happening inside of me. It's also a problem when there are people in various groups, whether it's in a particular race, ethnicity, country, those type of things, that you feel things are being done that are wrong, and it's something then that you turn that inner emotion that you have into something to say someone needs to do something with those people. And there's a variety of different ways that people have often treated other people groups. But scapegoating is probably right up at the top. And when we scapegoat, begin to kind of project our own frustration, our own fears, and usually it's upon a vulnerable group of people in some way that do not have the ability to fight back verbally, or educationally or whatever it may be. Scapegoating, though, is this process of transferring blame. So when there's a downturn in the economy, when there is something that happens, we look for people that we can say this is the group if that is to blame. Sometimes this scapegoating gets so normalized that people don't realize that they are being conditioned in the family of origin that they grew up in, or perhaps just but through education or peer group type of perspectives and opinions of other groups. And in many ways, this is high school all over again, where you have various types of groups, the jocks, the academics, all of these people are placed into groups. Then all of a sudden, there is kind of a tension between these types of groups, and there's sometimes blame that is cast upon a particular group. Seems like we never fully outgrow the high school dynamic, but it does become a greater problem, I think, the older we get and the more influence and power that we have, either economically or by position, to be able to really do some damage toward other people. So Rene Girard, I know I've mentioned him in the past, is a French historian and literary theorist that talks about this quite a bit. And he talks about scapegoating being kind of a mechanism that keeps certain groups together. So if we have a common enemy and we can scapegoat that group, it will hold us in unity because we all hate the same group or the same types of people. And what often happens is the complexity of this sociological dynamic is often simplified. And it is simplified in such a way that because a certain group looks a particular way, or they hold to a particular religion, or they have certain traditions that I feel uncomfortable with, then I can project, and you're right alongside with me in projecting that same type of feeling toward that particular group. So, in many ways, it's kind of a psychological reflex, but it's what helps us to keep getting along. And if we have a common target that we can scapegoat, then one of the things that can happen is any disagreement that we have between each other, it gets kind of watered down because this is the greater animosity over here against this particular group. So it really is quite an amazing psychological dynamic that takes place among all people everywhere, all around the world. So let's talk about some of these people groups, and these are common groups that are often marginalized in some way, or they are blamed in some way. And I will begin with anti-Semitism. Now, one of the things that often happens with this particular group of people, the Jewish people, goes back thousands of years. And I don't know if you've ever heard anything like this or not, but in looking for someone to blame for the death and execution of Jesus, um, it was often turned to the Jews. Historically, the Jews were to be blamed for the death of Jesus. And then that was kind of used to justify persecution or discrimination against this group of people. And the Gospels do depict the Jews being a part of this plot to have Jesus arrested and to have Jesus crucified. But ultimately, it is not the full group of people that does this. And yet, that's how it is often talked about. The Jews, they're to blame. Now, the text that has been often used to blame the Jewish people is usually the Gospels, and usually it's those texts that we look at during this season of the year. And that, during Lent, we often look at the Gospels more than maybe other times during the year. And there is kind of a blaming of the Jewish people that's rooted in a concept. Maybe you've heard this term, maybe you haven't. Uh, uh, Deicide is a term that means the killing of God. Who's to blame for the killing of God? And so Jesus is Lord and Christ, and Christians claim that he is the second person of the Trinity, deity in the flesh. So when you kill Jesus, you did not just kill a human being, you killed God in the process. Now, early Christian writers kind of picked up on that. And as we talk about the Passion Week of Jesus coming up in a few weeks here, we'll note that ultimately the decision to crucify Jesus was made by Pontius Pilate. But early Christian writers often minimize the role of Pontius Pilate because he did something symbolic. He says, I want to release a prisoner to you, and I'll let you, Jewish people, decide who I am going to release. So one is Barabbas, the other is Jesus. And the Jewish people present choose Barabbas over Jesus. And then Pilate says, I see no reason to give this man the death sentence. And then he washes his hands of it. Well, ultimately, it's still his decision that calls the Roman soldiers to take Jesus to the cross and crucify him. Well, early Christian writers, because he washed his hands of his role in this, tended to minimize the role of Pontius Pilate and elevate the role of the Jewish people. But I think if you take a closer look at the text, you're going to find that there are some Jewish people involved. There's certainly Roman authority involved, and there's Roman soldiers involved. So there's a variety of different people that are involved in the crucifixion. Ultimately, it's under the authority of the Romans, though, that execute Jesus. And you know that the Roman soldiers tortured Jesus, tore his garments, put a crown of thorn on his head, and ridiculed him as they put him on the cross. And then to make sure that he was dead, you remember a Roman soldier took a spear and thrust it into the side of Jesus to make sure that he had died. Now, there were Jewish leaders present, and they played a significant role in the arrest and trial of Jesus. But it was the Romans ultimately that had the final authority. Now, it's interesting to me. Here's the contrast. So we might be able to say the Jews, totality, crucified Jesus, but you never hear the Italians crucified Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And the Italians aren't implicated into the death of Jesus. Only the Roman authorities that put him there. But that's a little unfair. It's not that all Italians wanted Jesus dead, and so they shouldn't be blamed. But we do that to the Jewish people, and I think it's important to understand that there are different participants in this whole process, and ultimately they come together, but they are not a part of a collective group that has the same opinion. Just as there were those that wanted Jesus arrested and crucified, there were also those that while Jesus was walking the Via Dolorosa and carrying the cross, there were those that were weeping. There were those that were crying. There were those that were protesting that this innocent man was being killed. And that was Jewish people as well as non-Jewish people. So overall, this had a big effect on the Jewish people. Under imperial Christianity, and what I mean by that is after Emperor Constantine came to the throne in 314 AD, he took the idea of the cross as a symbol of conquest, and he conquered a lot of different people. But while he was in power, Jewish people began to have increasing legal restrictions. They weren't allowed to build new synagogues because he's a Christian. Constantine made Christianity the state religion. Jews were not allowed to hold office either. So there was already some prejudice that was starting to take place. But it really gets ramped up in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages is called the Dark Ages for a variety of reasons. A lot of things went bad. And in the Fourth Lateran Council of the Catholic Church in 1215 AD, there were laws that were passed that restricted Jewish rights and began to segregate them from Christians. And so they were kind of they stood apart and they stood out in society. Now, long before the Germans came along, back in the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church required distinctive clothing for Jews and required them to live in separate neighborhoods that we would call ghettos today. Then it gets even worse. During the Crusades, Jewish communities were attacked in Europe. And then by the 12th century, all of this conspiracy theory type stuff against Jewish people began to emerge. And there was one called the blood libel. I don't know if you've ever heard Netanyahu talk about blood libel, but what that is in the 12th century, there was accusations made against the Jews that were murdering Christian children so that they could use these children's blood in their religious sacrifices and rituals. There's no truth to that. But it's one of those conspiracy theories, just like there is always conspiracy theories that doesn't hold much accuracy to them, but boy, it amps people up and it strokes that prejudice that's already inside of them. Now, it's interesting here. You can see on the slide the Jews were evicted from England, France, and Spain. They're told to get out. Even in Rome itself, Jews were evicted for a period of time and then were allowed to come back into the city. And that's why Paul, if you remember our study in the book of Romans, that's why Paul wrote the letter to try to get these Jews and Gentiles to get along. Now, it didn't help that you had Christian leaders that didn't push back on these opinions. Martin Luther, the great grandfather of the Reformation, was a raging Jew hater. And it's found in a lot of his writings. It's reflected even in some of the books that he wanted to have excluded from the New Testament. He didn't want the book of James. And most people think that's because he didn't like the idea of work righteousness and that type of thing. It might be, though, James was the half brother of Jesus, and it might look upon the fact that this was a Jewish author that wrote that epistle. It's interesting that Martin Luther wanted to force Jews to become Christian converts, sort of like many of the missionaries that came into Mexico, trying to force a lot of the Mexicans to turn from their local religions to Catholicism. So this happened all over the world over the course of time. However, it comes to a head in 1936. In 1936, European Jews were hated by the Nazis, and the Nazis published a special version of the Gospel of John that really amplified the Jewish guilt of murdering Christ, and it was done in a way to kind of demonize the Jews. This caught on, and the Jews were demonized. And we know the story, right? It led to the Holocaust, and yet what we find is that that had an effect also in other countries, even our own, in America too. Even as I have here, even Henry Ford described the Jews as the scavengers of the world. So here's the inventor of the automobile, looked down upon the Jews, and there's that kind of built-in anti-Semitism sometimes that's there when we hear people saying that Jewish people control the world, they control the economy, all that type of thing. Um, Now, I do think there is something to be said for their influence in a lot of different areas, but it doesn't justify anti Semitism. Now, here's the problem: the Jewish leaders began to use this anti Semitism of their history, and they began to internalize it to the point where um, everything is anti-Semitism. If you criticize the Jews in any way, shape, or form, then you're an anti-Semite. That's not true. You can love Jewish people and not like what the Jewish government is doing. Um, but nonetheless, there's that is overused. It's kind of that victimhood type of approach. And it doesn't help that American eschatology that leans into heavy Zionism uses this as a way of saying, well, there's got to be this Armageddon war that takes place at the end of time. And eventually, because the Jews crucified Jesus, they will meet their death because God is angry at them unless they become Messianic Jews, unless they accept Christ. There's no truth to that, okay? That's just a way of using the scriptures through a particular lens. I find it interesting that the United States has spent billions and billions of dollars for the Jews to fight against the Palestinians, and really we're paying for a genocide over the last couple of years here, and yet at the same time there is this anti-Semitism among some people that have a far view that God is going to eventually turn his back on the Jews and so forth. It gets real complex, it gets real muddy, and you need to be aware that a lot of this is just religious bigotry. A lot of it is just prejudice and scapegoating and that type of thing. So you would think that the Jewish people would have learned a lesson because they were the target of anti Semitism for so many centuries, but they didn't. You know, it's sort of like back in the Old Testament when they were freed from Egypt. They were in slavery all those years. By the time you get to Solomon, he begins enslaving people to build his temple. You would think, well, no, 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 we were slaves. We're not going to do that to other people, but that's what happened. So the Jewish people began to develop this hatred toward in particular Muslims. Now, before I get to that slide, I forgot I had this slide up here. When you then factor in the belief in eternal punishment and torture in hellfire, and you bring Christian fundamentalists into this scenario, far right wing evangelical Christianity, or I'd rather call it fundamentalist Christianity, talks about how we are the only ones that have the right religion. And usually they use John 14 as their proof text, okay? I'm going to read that for you because you're very familiar with it, but I do want to point something out to you. Maybe you have not noticed here, okay? In John chapter 14, Jesus is about ready to enter into his last days, and he turns to his disciples in John 14:1, and he says, do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house has many rooms. If that were not so, would I have told you that I'm going there to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come back and take you to be with me, that you may be where I am. You know the way to the place where I am going. And Thomas said, Lord, we don't know where you are going, so how can we know the way? Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. Jesus is not answering Thomas's question here. Notice that. Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? He then says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And we usually take that to mean there's only one right way to get to heaven, and that's through me. But that's not what he's answering. He's answering really what Philip picks up on in verse 8. Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Now read verse 6 again. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Okay, now we talk about that. No one can come to God except through Jesus. But he goes on, if you really know me, you will know my Father as well. He's saying, if you want to know God, I'm the way, the truth, and the life about what God is like. If you know me, you know my Father as well. And from now on, you do know him, and you've seen him because you've seen me. And what he's saying here, I think, is not so much a hard nose, there's only one religious stream that can be used for God. What I think he's answering here is the way you'll know what God is through me. I've embodied that for the last 3 years with you. So if I can add one word, it might illuminate it. No one comes to know the Father except through me. Or if I want to add an adjective, no one comes to know what the Father's like except through me. And so I think what Jesus is answering is really a little bit different than what we often make this text say, because this is the cornerstone verse that is used to say, there's only one right religion, and you better get right with Jesus and that type of thing. Now, the problem is this, and it's been the problem for millennium, and that is there are places around the world that do not have the opportunity to know Jesus, thus to know what God is like, because it's a whole different culture, it's a whole different language, it's a whole different religious tradition. So many people that use this, and they're okay with the fact that by the title of this slide, to hell with them all, we're the only ones that are right. What I find interesting, it's fascinating, some of the things that you can find when you dig a little bit. So some Christian groups, and this goes back a little ways, this is not all the way back to the Middle Ages, but Pope Paul VI in 1965 showed appreciation for other faiths around the world in this document called Nostra Aetate, and it teaches that while the fullness of truth is in Christ, God does not deny salvation to those who, through no fault of their own, do not know the gospel, the good news of what God is like, but seek God still with all their heart. So what is said there is, he says in that document, show appreciation for all faiths, all religions, and promote unity, love, and peace among them. Don't use our differences as a source of hate. But that's exactly what is done. So let's come back to the Jewish people. So they have been the target of anti-Semitism for so long. But then they do a turnabout. And I asked the question, is turnabout fair play? So the way Jewish people were treated, ironically, became the way the government has chosen to treat Muslims. Benjamin Netanyahu and other officials frequently say that they are fighting enemies, in quotes, the enemies of civilization to ensure the survival and safety of the Jewish state. Friends, most Muslim families are concerned about the same thing American families are: having a good job, being able to take care of their kids. Yes, they worship um, through Islam, but they're not terrorists. But did you see what Netanyahu did here? He's scapegoated an entire religious group. They're the ones that are, do they have terrorists? Absolutely. Should those terrorists be brought to justice? Absolutely. But especially in the last 50 plus years, Muslims became the target of hatred by various groups, not only within Judaism, but Christianity as well. And so you see that a lot of things that happened to the Palestinians in particular, because they lived in the West Bank and other places close to Jerusalem, they were denied certain civil rights. They were basically kind of kept in confinement, kind of an open air type of prison type thing. And what happened is when certain extreme terrorists did bring about some casualties, now instead of finding those who committed the crime, the entire people group has been scapegoated, blamed, and unfortunately, since then, I'll tell you, since 2023, the Palestinians, their everything, their businesses, their homes, their hospitals, their schools have been obliterated. And there's approximately about 70,000 plus casualties that the Jews have committed against them. So, what's a word that we can use for this? Islamophobia. It can be held by many different people, but primarily the Jewish people and Christians have extreme forms of Islamophobia. And of course, we have our own fear of Muslims um, since 9/11, the many years ago, and in particular, it's been ramped up since the Hamas attacks of October 2023. Um, since there was a Muslim politician that was elected to be the new mayor of New York City, there's been some dangerous things that were coming about, demonstrations and threats and that type of thing, simply because, hey, we're going to root out these Muslims. And so Mondani is his last name. Is We'll see if he survives his term, or if he gets attacked. But anyways, my point is, it was the Jews; they were targets. Now it's Muslims that are the targets. And I think a lot of it is basically a misunderstanding of Islam. If you take sacred texts that have any um, confusion to it at all, and it can be twisted, you can take parts of the Old Testament and justify all kinds of violence based upon what the Old Testament texts say about their enemies and that type of thing. Islam is the third largest religion in the United States after Christianity and Judaism, but it's on the rise. Islam is one of the most radically diverse religions, though, in the United States. They're not all the same. During the Crusades, Christians got charged up about trying to reclaim certain parts of the Holy Land from Muslims. That's a whole history in and of itself. But this rhetoric of violence just keeps going on and on and on. And often Muslims are portrayed as enemies of Christianity. And certainly it's understandable that that's the knee jerk reaction after 9/11. A lot of innocent people were killed. But what it turned into is anyone that's not white or someone that wears a different type of clothing is suspicious. And that's kind of what Muslims have had to live with since 9/11 in our own country. This is what's tragic. It becomes a whole religion to hate rather than the extremists within that religion. So Islamophobia within Christianity is not an inherent part of the faith that we have. Yes, are there rivalries and historical conflicts and political tensions? Yes, but that doesn't justify hating a whole religion. But what it has done is at least it has provided a convenience for Christians because now we can use that type of prejudice inside of us and direct it toward people who don't look like us, that have different religion than us, and have different customs than us. There are people that are poor, LGBTQ, blacks. They're hated on by certain groups within Christianity, but not like Islam. I mean, it's a whole different level. But if you study what um, what Islam and Muslims actually believe toward Jesus, while they follow a prophet that they think came later after Jesus, Muhammad, they considered Jesus a prophet and that there's much to learn from him. I think this is Islamophobia, though, probably really got amped up because Christianity is in decline, whereas Islam was on the rise around the world. So there's that inbred fear that, are we going to live under some type of Islamic state at some point? I think that's really pushing it to extremes. Um, yes, extreme expressions of Islamic terrorism um, is something that needs to be dealt with, but so is extreme expressions of white nationalism too. So it's not just one group, but that stereotyping can often really rise to a level, just like it did toward the Jewish people under the Nazis, if we're not careful and prevent that from happening. So I want you to think again about Islam for a moment. I'm not going to become Muslim, but it I do need to have an appreciation of what their learning is and why they have certain traditions. When you think about it, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are the three major world religions that all believe in one single deity. When we hear the name Allah, all that is an Arabic word that means the God, the one true God. So, it's no different than Jesus when he said that he calls God Abba, right? It's a name, all right? And there's different names for God all around the world depending upon what the language is. Did you know that while Muslims revere Jesus as a great prophet, there is more text in the Quran about the Virgin Mary than there is in the Bible? They elevate and honor the Virgin Mary, the mother of this great prophet. Islam teaches that Quran is a revelation from God, much like the Jews do of the Old Testament Torah, and Christians do both Old Testament and New Testament. But I think we get a little bit miscue on this religion. That's why I want to recommend a book to you. And it's not just about Muslims, it's about all world religions. It's a book called Holy Envy by Barbara Brown Taylor. She takes each religion, and she's a professor, and she took her classes to experience, kind of like on field trips, all these different religions. And then she summarizes what she could appreciate from each of the religions that she taught uh, her her class about. So you can look that up. The book is in the library. I think there's an audio book of it as well. Okay, so they're not the only ones that get targeted. Think about atheism for a moment. If you rewind back to the 1970s, remember, everything was about Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Do you remember that? She was the great atheist that was going to eliminate Christianity because she's going to convince all of our young people to become atheists. She was demonized. I don't know anything about Madalyn Murray O'Hair except the fact that she was an atheist. But what you find is there's always been atheists. And in more recent decades, authors like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, even Carl Sagan, these were all atheists that, um, had their criticism of Christianity, but it doesn't mean that they were bad people. But that's what we started to do as Christians is stereotype even atheists, saying you can't trust them, you should look down on them, they're all bad, and that type of thing. So I I know a lot of Christians that aren't very good people too, but I don't characterize all the other Christians based upon one or two or half a dozen that I might know. So Pope Francis, so this is more recent than Pope Paul VI. Pope Francis in 2013 emphasized, I don't know if it was an encyclical or if it was a different type of document. He emphasized the importance of doing good as a principle that unites all of humanity. So, what he was talking about is we should be good to all people, atheists, Jewish people, Muslims, Christians. And he, in many ways, talks about doing good as the glue that can bring people of all various types of viewpoints together under the umbrella in our world. White supremacists don't want to do that, though, and we've talked a lot in some of the studies we've done on white supremacy. Um, and white supremacy has a big spectrum. Okay, it can be as violent as the KKK and the neo Nazis, or it can be simply people that want to put only Christians into political positions, that type of thing. But the heinous acts of white supremacy that could be carried out against individuals and groups is absolutely contrary to Christian values. There's not one fruit of the Spirit that you'll find in the scripture that elevates hate as something good. The fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, self control, faithfulness, long suffering, all these types of things, all positives and so forth. But if here's that unifying factor again: if you don't hate the same people I hate, then I can't trust you. In Luke chapter 24, chapter 4, not chapter 4, verse 24, it's interesting how the people who were elevating Jesus, listening to Jesus, and following Jesus turn on him. I want to read this for you because it's interesting. In Luke chapter 4, and you come down to verse 24, he is talking and teaching. He's just finished up reading the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue. He rolls up the scroll. He says, what I've read to you is being fulfilled in your hearing. Then down in verse 23, Jesus said to them, surely you will quote this proverb to me, physician, heal yourself. And you will tell me, do here in your hometown what we heard that you did in Capernaum. So what are they talking about? Do the miracles here. Do the healings here, just like you did in Capernaum. Then he says this, truly I tell you, no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. This is Gentile territory. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian, non-Jewish person. All the people in the synagogue were furious. You're supposed to hate those Gentiles. Don't you understand that, Jesus? All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. So they wanted to kill him because he was showing his God's heart for people that were Gentiles, people that were not a part of the covenant. So it's interesting to me that when white supremacists then become part of Christian nationalism, well, what do they want to do? Well, you remember back on January the 6th, when Mike Pence, the vice president, wanted to carry out his duty of, certifying the election, these people wanted to hang him. That's Luke 4 all over again, okay? What they're telling us is we only want white Christians to be in power. We only want people that are like us. Usually it's built upon some type of belief that when our nation was started, it was started by white people with Christianity. It's what I call the myth of, Christian origins. There was a lot of different types of people, from deists to atheists to others that were of different ethnicities that were all a part of the early years of our country. But in 2023, a survey said 81% of Christian nationalists agreed with this statement, that immigrants are invading our country and replacing our cultural and ethnic background. So again, it's stereotyping and it's scapegoating, and what you find is it's all kind of built upon panic and fear. Yes, our world is changing. There's no doubt about that. However, instead of adapting and adopting and seeing how we can work together, often there's this violence that is often used. So here's a professor from the University of Pennsylvania. Her name is Anthea Butler. She wrote a book not too long ago called White Evangelical Racism. And she gives kind of a history of the evangelical movement and the racial elements of it. So this is another book that you might be interested in. Here's 2 quotes. Number 1, because of racism, evangelical decency was lost and evangelicals' resentments grew. And a second one, evangelicals will have to become more accepting of others, willing to let go of racism, and actually pay attention to the red letter words of Jesus. Right now, I don't think there is any way to fix the movement unless it has a crushing, decisive defeat at its quest to make America a theocracy. A lot of insight there. I want to finish this study with this last slide. there is a huge difference between someone who claims to be a Christian and those who claim to be a follower of Jesus. The two are not necessarily the same. You can be a Christian in religion, you can be a Christian in even its beliefs, but your values and actions do not line up with the teachings of Jesus. Christian nationalists have kind of wielded this faith as kind of a tool for control, whereas followers of Jesus are trying to align themselves with his call toward justice and mercy and love. Um, and the choice will be ours. And I think that's the main point of the book here. There is an exodus from organized religion in our country, and a lot of it is directly related to some of the xenophobia and hatred and racism that is being done in the name of Christ. So if you continue to stand up for individuals that are kind of the targets of that type of treatment, I think maybe we might find that we might catch the ear of some people who have already kind of dismissed us. So we'll see what happens on into the years ahead. All right, I am going to stop our recording and we'll see if you have some thoughts.